Cool.
All right.
Yeah, I think we're here to
So,
talk about compliance and approval checks and merge requests. Left some comments and we've got discussion points, and I think Sam's got the first one up on the agenda, so we can start there.
yeah, so I just wanted to level set before we really dig into it around what the goals we're trying to get out of this meeting are. Since we only have about 25 minutes, I figured that'd be a good thing to discuss up front. Based on the initial issue discussion, it wasn't clear to me if this was intended to be, hey, here's some feedback for future iterations as you continue developing on this, or if this is a, hey, we feel like you should stop development and do something else. And was wondering if we could just talk through that first.
Yeah, I put this in here. I want to say stop work. I don't think that's the right or fair thing to do, but that's what I want to say. And so I want to sort of get through this and see if we can all get to a comfortable spot. And if we can't, I think I'd ask that we stop, but I don't know that GitLab has a policy or process for a group asking another group to stop doing work. That's sort of why we have isolated groups that get to do whatever they want.
Sure. So I actually saw an MR that I think would be really helpful for us here. I'm hoping we can discuss the concerns in this meeting and we don't have to talk through stop work. I saw an MR get created though about escalate early. So Kai, if you and I can't figure this out together, we can always, put something together, talk to David about it and get him to make a decision with us. And that'd be how I would propose we'd move forward, because at this point, we're not really prepared to stop work. We view this as a first iteration. It's off by default to limit the blast radius, and we feel comfortable, moving forward with taking yours and other people's feedback into consideration for follow-on efforts.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Coderview is also working, I'll just let you know, on a separate MR to highlight how we want other groups to interact with us when they want to touch things in the MR moving forward. And some of that would come with having more of these conversations much earlier than where we're at today. And this is sort of a consistent concern for Coderview, is that every group to the right of us on the ops side, and now we're going left, and people are also starting to do this. Everyone wants their things on the merge request page. And then at the same time, we're under a constant barrage of performance and usability concerns and all these other things going on, and they all fall on us, even though we largely don't add sort of new features. It's other groups that do this. And so we're trying to figure out how we balance making sure that product and design are engaged much earlier in this moving forward.
Well, with that, then should we jump into the top of the concerns that were raised then?
Yeah, I think we can do that. I think the first one up is the terminology, and this is probably the easiest one to solve. It may depend on some of the answers to the below one, but right now, I would say we have a concept of approvals and we have a concept of merge checks. And those are the two things that exist. This took both of those, mashed them into one, and then from a UI placement, put them in approvals. And so I think it would be good probably to understand what this is and what the user experience is to decide if it is one of these two things, and if not, are we really committing to introducing a third concept of some kind into the merge request? Is that a path where we want to go down here?
Yeah, I can field that one, Kai. So our initial thought around making this not a strict requirement was what steered us away from merge checks, because we don't want to prevent a merge request going in necessarily. Our first experiment was just trying to expose that API that customers were using as a compliance check, a soft compliance check, because nothing's withholding them from doing it today unless they build some custom integrations to hamper that from happening. So I think what we were initially trying to do is just find what's an area of the merge request that we won't totally conflate the experience, in which it's completely taking up a lot of screen real estate, perhaps maybe adding more confusion. I initially thought the approvers section worked well. I was kind of taking it off of what Daniel Mora had initially suggested since he was in my role before I joined GitLab. And because we saw it as like an optional thing, and we thought you could have optional approvers, it felt like a natural place to just start with an iteration. Now, its final destination, I think, could totally be up to debate. It's farther down the list, but I'll highlight where Pedro provided a suggestion around like status checks being introduced into branch policies. I think that really does represent well the intent of what our customers are looking for. So I do think a third type of check is necessary, but the way we integrate it, I totally see evolving over time.
So to clarify then, these are not required to be green to hit the merge button?
Nope, not in the first or probably many first releases.
And they don't require anyone to actually click any buttons to like approve that it's not green.
Nope, just awareness. We do have like a follow-up issue that we like to build upon to give the user the ability to like retry an API if it fails the first time. But it was just cut from scope for the initial release because it was just too much functionality to bake in all at one time. So we were trying to roll it out incrementally.
Okay.
In terms of actually using the term approval gate, I really don't have a strong opinion on it. I was purely going off of what I had heard from other team members from their experience with interacting with customers since this idea kind of existed before I joined. So I was taking a lot of what other people had already sourced for information. I can totally see though why you're saying it can be confusing. Yeah, I agree.
Can you, Austin, can you explain a little bit what you meant by it doesn't block the merge and it's, at least for the first iterations, it's for awareness. Can you explain what that awareness is and how it's valuable?
Yeah, so I think eventually we would like for it to be able to become a blocker. I think I'm sharing my desktop with Firefox and has Sigma. So like this case where we have like this questionable link that's failed, we don't want to block the ability to approve. We don't want to block the ability to merge just because this didn't pass. We just want to give these users in GitLab the ability to see that a API that they're relying on, similar to that status check that you're highlighting in Azure, as a way just to keep people informed about the other systems that are relying on these different changes. So I think in the future, like the vision is we'd like for it to be able to be another hurdle for compliance teams, or at least teams that care about this level of compliance, not for everybody. But for now, we were just wanting to play with the least blocking thing, which was just show status of these things.
So by default, for security and compliance in general, we're going to be taking a fail open sort of approach. You know, I know Sid and Matt had a number of videos discussing like if people need to push to production, we can't block to that case in default. So like Austin saying, this is really to raise awareness. Hey, there's a problem. You should probably act on it, but you can still go ahead, merge, because if your app is down, that's the most pressing thing. So unless customers want to build something custom or we introduce a saying in the future, it will be a fail open sort of setting.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think in a way that is what we have today for security vulnerabilities, where by default we just make users aware that there is like a critical security vulnerability, but it's by default it doesn't block the merge. It would only block the merge if you set up the vulnerability check approval rule and make it required. So that would be the only way. But the difference is that for vulnerability checks and license checks, there are humans involved, and they use the GitLab UI to make that happen, and you assign them as reviewers. So there's a, with approval rules, what we're trying more and more is to keep things on the human level, right? So to like this is a button that you press, you have reviewers, you see the status of approvals by those people, and the moment we start to mix these concepts, I think it could become more confusing about what is an approval in the end and what is an approval rule. I think in a way what you're describing would be to allow customers to define their own merge requests widgets in a way. So today, the ones we have baked into the app are code quality, security vulnerabilities, browser performance, blah, blah, blah. We have all of those lines, all of those different widgets. And it seems like what you would like is, I want an API that allows customers to create these on the fly, and possibly in the future, the result of those widgets, so the information that they say, could block the merge. Is that an accurate description?
That sounds like a really great like long-term vision for how you could provide a lot more flexibility for customers or users really to define how they want their merge request experience to play out. And I guess as a example of that need would be the number of variations that we have in terms of the different checks that come into a merge request. Going back to your initial point on the approvals section being tied to like specific people and approvers, I think that makes total sense. I think when we initially designed and discussed this feature, I don't think vulnerability checks had been introduced yet. I think that maybe came after. This was going back to last August, so I'm not 100% sure on that. But would you think it's reasonable that before we consider maybe making this a feature that's on by default and not behind a feature flag, that we find a new home for it somewhere else in the merge request page that makes more sense, given the information architecture of the page?
That's a good question, because we're also facing a lot of challenges with the existing widgets. So in a way,
Sure.
What this is doing from an experience standpoint is just like, instead of creating a new visible widget, is placing that information inside of a collapsed area, which you're showing here. And that collapsed area happens to exist inside of the approval rules area.
It does.
And to be honest, I think, go ahead, Sam.
Go ahead, sorry. I was just going to say, I wonder if another way we could approach this, because it sounds like the big disconnect is between this section is generally intended for human interaction, but if it's just an API, it's a faceless computer. I wonder if we could do something like say, hey, Austin is the admin for third-party compliance system. If this is blocking, you know, go ping him. That gives the person someone actionable to go reach out to if they don't understand what it is. Or if it is, you know, like Acme compliance, they can just go into that, do the thing, and unblock themselves. Wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I think like that's sort of the question, right? Like if this was a third-party service that a human had to then approve or deny, like I don't think we'd sort of be in this position where we're wondering. It would then operate much more like the current security checks, where like if you cross like to the high and critical vulnerabilities and you have that approval rule configured, an approval rule pops up and someone has to click an approve button to merge, right? That does show up in the approval widget. Whereas this one is like faceless computer.
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking was seeing that approval gate whether it's passed or not would influence your decision making on whether or not to approve the merge request. So if that API sends a failed message back, you might not want to approve the merge request because one of the gates failed.
Yeah,
Because
I think
the other side of this API, it may or may not have a human attached to it. It might be some process that just scans code in the MR and gives an automated pass fail, or it could be a ping that goes to a human. They review something, they manually click a button and it communicates back. So just based on this, we don't necessarily know if it's computer or human generated the pass fail status.
yeah, I think a good way to look at this, if we were thinking about the human and not human, is that concept of that I was saying before, and mimicking what the security scanning is doing, or what the license compliance widget is doing. But from an API standpoint, you would create these, customers would create these on the fly. So if you have a check, well, I don't know, I didn't see in the previous screen what that would be, but I don't know, if we had a check for X, you would create a new widget just for that. And if you wanted, you could also have an approval rule for it. So I think what we're talking about here is two things. One is giving the information from an external service that is posting information to the merge request because it scanned the changes and, hey, this is what's happening. So we create and give that information on the fly. And then as a second step, if you want to do something about it, if you want to block the merge, you have two things that you can do. You could just block it directly and say, hey, this is a merge check and it's not passing the check and it's blocked and you need to fix this. Or alternatively, you use approval rules as an override mechanism. And that's what the vulnerabilities check and the compliance check, the license check are for. They are override mechanisms because you can block the merge, but you can use approval rules for someone human to approve and say, I'm okay with this going forward nonetheless.
I now understand your statement. So thank you for clarifying that. I get it now. You're saying so because if you see a security scan that you don't pass or there's a vulnerability, a human in the approver section can still choose to approve the merge request despite those things.
Correct.
All right, got it. Now it's crystal. Got it.
So I think in a way,
call it a quick time check. We're at 20 minutes, and I think we're still on the first one. We've touched on some of the other ones, but I just want to make sure we're really getting to Kai's most pressing points.
I'm okay with moving forward.
Yeah, I think we've talked about sort of the approval rules one sort of in this last piece that covers off on the difference between those two things, unless there's anyone else that wants to dive into these. But really the contention for us is that anything in the approvals widget is people make an active choice to click a button and do something. And if it's not a people making an active choice, it's not part of that.
Okay.
Just
makes sense.
For fun, I'm going to throw out like a crazy alternative idea. If it were possible to not just approve, but to reject, like under the approvals umbrella to say, no, I disagree with this, and then have overrides, then we could bring everything together under the same umbrella. But it seems like otherwise not possible.
I would say rejection is a hotly debated topic. And I think the code review group has long had an opinion, and I am the torchbearer, I guess, of this opinion now. We don't want anything that can block a merge request. And so there are lots of people that come from Garrett and other systems that want downvotes and blocks and rejects until you fix whatever I've told you to fix. They're 4-year-old issues with hundreds of upvotes, and we sort of actively say no on a regular basis to that. So I think we haven't been pushed hard enough yet to allow rejection as a human element outside of comments.
Well, I think that is a quick and clear answer to that question then. Thanks.
Point C actionability. I think we talked about this a little bit. One of the things that, we want to make sure of for pieces is that as an engineer, if you are told something, you can action it. And I don't necessarily mean action to retry. One of the benefits of approvals is like we tell you who can approve it. And so you know who to go ping in a comment, right? I know that I need to ask Pedro to do the UX review because he is the UX approver of this. And so we want to make sure that if you are an engineer and you end up in an MR and you get a failed something that requires you to like deal with it to move forward, you know who, right? It's not helpful. We're having this conversation with code quality. It would not be helpful if you told me in an MR that my code reduced the code quality, but then didn't tell me how to like make that code better to get above the threshold that I need to merge, because I may not know how to do that or who to ask to do that thing. And so this is less about like a retry button and doing that, and more about like, if this fails, what do I as engineer do to get my code into the merge?
Yeah. I totally understand that point.
Yeah, this would rely on the it's all on the customer who implements this, right? So they have to make sure that they give the appropriate information, and that we provide a way for them to give that information. So I think that also comes down to having really good documentation and best practices that teaches customers how they should present things and word things and what they should link to. So we don't end up with users annoyed like GitLab sucks because no, it doesn't
For
suck
real.
that much. It's just that the way you developed it, it doesn't give you the information.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's certainly something we're going to have to figure out before we do a sort of on by default approach. I do think there is a nuance that there's a difference between saying, hey, there's a problem and here's how you can fix a problem. There is still value in throwing the red flag up, even if I have no idea how to fix it, right? So we can approach those two separately, and that's really how we're doing it here. This is throwing the flag up. We need to help them figure out, what do I do now?
Right.
Before we do on by default.
Yeah, I think in my mind, what would make sense is like a follow-up to this, if we continue building it out, is before we really turn this on by default, we should have an experience more closely aligned to security scanning and license compliance using like this informational section, as opposed to dedicating it to the approvers area.
Yeah, I think that's the informational piece, right? None of those, that block right there that you're showing with all those widgets there, sort of impact the merge, right? They're purely like informational, and that's fine to alert that. It's when you want to go and impact the merge, you need to help people figure out how to get through that step. The merge button does this with merge checks. Like that merge button right now, it says the pipeline for the merge request didn't complete. And that text changes right every time and tells you, unhelpfully, you could resolve that, and then the next one will show up of what it is.
the 25 merge checks that might exist.
Yeah, all of the merge checks that are there, right? They all help guide you through like all of the things you need to do to resolve that. But that's sort of the difference between those pieces of information.
Well, and because the approach we've taken so far is informational for awareness, like Austin pointed out earlier, and wouldn't block the merge from going through, does that really help address the main point of concern here?
Yeah, I would, and I think this is, if you move that out of approvals, right? If I think we're all maybe agreed that that's not the right spot yet in the way it's functioning, and it goes to an informational widget, then it doesn't need to be as actionable. It can be much more informative down there because it's not in this like area that's sort of designed for action. My concern before was when you look at those mockups, like there's a red X, nobody's face is next to it, nothing else is there. Like, what do I do as an engineer at that point?
Sam, as an idea, we haven't gotten to touching the MR page yet. we've only really started with being able to add this rule into the approvers rules area. I could prioritize just alternatively creating a different vision for how we landed on the MR page and put that part of the development on pause until we can better clarify how it shows up on the MR page.
So doing some work to focus on how it show up as more of like an informational sort of widget rather
Yeah,
than where
just
it
like
is
show
the
it in
approval
line here with
process.
security scanning and license compliance, as opposed to putting it up here like we have it kind of like in the mockups now.
Yeah, it seems like a good activity to work on. Another time check. We only have 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure we talk through next steps on this. I know we didn't get through the whole agenda document, but what I'd like to propose is we go ahead and create an issue to finish some of these discussions that we either started or didn't get to start. We can do that asynchronously. From my perspective, the feedback was great. We really appreciate it. This is going to help make GitLab the product better. This doesn't sound like blocking feedback to me still though. So Kai, I don't know if you still feel like this needs to be a stop work conversation or feedback for future iterations, but you and I can probably work through that asynchronously as well. Unless you are on the same page and we don't have to do it.
I don't think it's a stop work, assuming you take into consideration the like move this out of the approval settings right now and move this out of like the approval rules on the merge request page. Like sort of if you undo the path that you're on and like go down the path of like making it an informational widget, then like we'd be supportive of that. I think if you were going to continue in like the approval rules area, I think we still have the finer pieces to figure out there.
Got it. Well, I would view it as a change, not an unwind that we can do. But I'd still like us to continue on since we've already got effort committed to this, I'd like us to continue on this path for the first iteration off by default, and then start taking some of that feedback in for future iterations before we get to an on by default sort of state.
Yeah, I mean, I'll leave it up to engineering to figure out how they best want to get to that end state and what they want to unwind or change or how to deal with that.
This to me as well sounds, the changes that you've described sound more like front end changes than back end changes. Nothing we've discussed, as far as I can tell, would change any of the work I'm doing, but we will need to discuss with Rob and Jan, our front end engineers, to potentially change what they're planning.
Yeah, and I think those are fine for next steps. The only other one would be performance. Just as an FYI, our group is going to spend Q2 working on performance for probably the second time in a year. And so just keep in mind with everything that you do, we get to be the brunt of the feedback when performance goes awry in the merge request. And so your thoughts about that when you're implementing things are appreciated, so we can deal with a little bit less of it.
Yeah, I think that's where I think using a feature flag is helpful. Like if it's not performant, don't have it on by default. I think as you define in that merge request that you're working out on for how teams can collaborate earlier, get that feedback and understand how to add things without impacting the MR like experience, that'll be helpful.
Yep. Awesome. We're at time. I appreciate it, everyone. I will I'll put the recording on YouTube as well, so you can share it back out to teams as appropriate. And then thanks. It was much appreciated and great discussion.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciated your feedback too, Kai and Pedro. You guys are awesome.
Thank you so much. Have a great day,
Thanks,
everyone.
folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.